This section dissolves the book's opening question, whether beauty lives in the object or in the beholder. Chatterjee's move is to reject the dichotomy itself. The question presupposes that perceiver and world are separable entities, so that beauty must sit in one bin or the other. Evolutionary psychology denies that premise. The mind is sculpted by its environment and tightly coupled to it, so you cannot probe the structure of a mind without bumping into properties of the world. The malformed question gets reframed into a well-posed one. What in the coupling of mind and world yields the experience of beauty? Ingrid Bergman's face, Bryce Canyon, and Euler's identity have no sensation in common. What they do share is a relation. That relational reframe is the license for the whole book, beauty studied as coupling, through people, places, and proofs. This section explains why the book reframes the question of beauty instead of answering it directly. Start with the old question, is beauty in the object or in the eye of the beholder? That question dissolves the moment you notice what it assumes. It presupposes that object and perceiver are separate things. Evolution denies exactly that. The mind was sculpted by the world and stays tightly coupled to it, so neither term stands alone. Chatterjee's opening move is a reframe. He stops asking where beauty is located and asks instead what it is, in the coupling of mind and world that yields the experience of beauty. That shift is the whole book's license to look inside the brain. The scattered anchors make the same point. Ingrid Bergman's face, Bryce Canyon, and Euler's identity are chosen precisely because they share no sensation in common. Their only common ground is the perceiver. And that is the point. Beauty turns out to be a relation. It lives in the coupling of perceiver and world, not as a property sitting inside the object. This section explains why facial beauty counts as universal and how the chapter establishes it. Strip the teacher, keep the answer, and whatever remains was never taught. That is the chapter's whole move. Facial beauty is universal because it survives the removal of culture. Two independent subtractions converge on the same point. First, people from isolated tribes who share no media, the Ache and the Hiwi, still agree with each other. Second, babies who have no media yet gaze longer at the faces adults call beautiful before Hollywood could tell them to. Both land on the same bedrock. Context can still turn the dial. Leader's Vienna study makes a handsome man read as a threat rather than a mate. But modulation only moves the reading. It never touches the 0 point. The universal is what the subtraction leaves behind. This part explains how one researcher decides whether facial beauty is cultural or innate, by stripping the suspected cause two independent ways and reading what remains. The strategy is simple. Strip the confound two independent ways, then read the residue. To decide whether faces are culturally beautiful or innately so, Chukwemeka, Chadiv, Beforger, any Hollywood exposure. Before Reese, he removes it spatially by comparing isolated peoples who never met. The Ake and the Hiwi agree with each other on which faces are attractive, despite having no contact. And he removes it developmentally by testing newborns, who gaze longer at the faces adults call attractive, before any Hollywood exposure. These are two orthogonal subtractions of the same suspected cause, and both still converge on the same answer. What survives independent removal of culture cannot itself be culture. It is the hard-wired bedrock on which cultural fashion only exaggerates. Context still tilts the reading. A threatening city mutes attraction to male faces, but the tilt rides on an invariant it cannot manufacture. This section explains that facial beauty is measurable. Once you strip away 4 centuries of prejudice dressed as measurement, Camper's facial angles, Lavater's chins, Blackford's blondes, strip those away, and what survives is that facial beauty is measurable by 3 parameters, none of which is ethnically parochial. The 3 are averageness, symmetry, and sexual dimorphism. The surprise that carries the chapter is Galton's accident. Overlaying criminal spaces to find the criminal type, he got a face more attractive than any of his inputs. Beauty is the central tendency, the composite, the statistical prototype, read-off features the way a mean is read off samples. Symmetry measures deviation from bilateral zero. Dimorphism measures the hormone-signaled distance from the sex average. Infants and every culture converge on the same 3 parameters, which is the chapter's wager that aesthetics has biological invariance. The later chapters will ground. This section explains why facial beauty reduces to measurement and the 3 parameters that carry it. Once you strip the prejudice, beauty resolves to measurement. 3 parameters, none of them specific to any ethnicity, predict facial attractiveness, averageness, symmetry, and sexual dimorphism. Each one reads a fitness signal rather than a matter of taste. Averageness is proximity to the statistical prototype. Galton's composite of criminals came out more attractive than any single face that composed it, and that accident is what seeded the whole finding. Symmetry indexes low developmental noise. Dimorphism amplifies the hormone markers that separate the sexes. Estrogen feminizes, testosterone the sexes. Estrogen feminizes. Here's the compression. What feels like idiosyncratic preference is a low-dimensional detector for mate quality cues. Its invariance across cultures and in infants is the proof. These detectors are read biology, innate rather than learned aesthetics. This section explains why body beauty carries the same signal that facial beauty already announces. The body reads out that signal on a second channel. Beauty is the perceptual measure of fertility and genetic quality, not a trait sitting on the surface, and the body simply carries that same measure a second way. Consider what all the classical markers have in common: symmetry, exaggerated, sexual dimorphism, a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.7 height, the V-shaped torso, every ideal proportion from Galen to Dürer. All of it resolves to one variable: how loudly the form advertises reproductive fitness. This is the move Chatterjee makes at this point in his arc. Having measured beauty in faces, he shows that the same generative rule predicts beauty in bodies and even in motion, the point light walker, the dancer's ring finger ratio. Beauty is a decoder for fitness. Change the carrier and the rule holds. Predict the next instance yourself. This part shows that the body simply repeats what the face already established. Chatterjee runs the same 3-parameter apparatus, symmetry, exaggerated sexual dimorphism, and averageness over bodies and finds it mostly holds. The one exception is averageness, because we rarely see enough unclothed bodies to build a prototype. The generator underneath is that beauty is the perceptual readout of an honest fitness signal. Waist-to-hip ratio advertises fertility. Symmetry advertises developmental quality. The same logic drives peacocks, swallows, and West Point cadets alike. So the chapter adds no fresh claim. It is a second confirming instance of one generator. Once you hold the face case, the body case is predictable. It closes by turning toward the brain that does the reading. This part lays out the toolkit the chapter hands you. The chapter is a toolkit. Chatterjee gives you the anatomy so that later chapters can say where beauty happens. The whole organ compresses to one primitive. The brain is a function computed by specialized modules wired into a parallel network. Two axes generate everything. The first is modularity. A part does one operation. So if you lose the face module in the condition called prosopagnosia, you keep everything else. The second is distributed processing. Distant modules fire together as one coordinated act. Every experience is then predictable as a pipeline. Sensory input enters. Limbic emotion and temporal lobe, meaning modify it. Frontal parietal attention acts on it. An aesthetic encounter is just that same pipeline run on something beautiful, which is the book's whole wager. This section explains why beauty is something the brain assembles rather than something it receives. Beauty is built in the brain of the beholder rather than in the eye. That inversion is the whole function of the chapter. Before you can locate an aesthetic encounter, you must accept that the encounter is a construction, and construction runs on two principles that generate everything after. The brain is modular. Each region computes one thing. Faces, places, bodies, and motion each own their own patch of cortex. The brain is also parallel and distributed. Those same patches fire together as a choreographed network. So vision shatters the world into features, and a distributed process reassembles it. This is the Humpty Dumpty problem. Give me those two axes plus an input, modify, output spine, and I can predict the next chapter. An aesthetic encounter is just a path traced through these modules into limbic reward. This part explains why beauty has no dedicated organ in the brain. The brain area that recognizes a face is the same one that fires harder when the face is beautiful, and it does so automatically, even when you are judging identity or shape rather than looks. The classifier is the evaluator. The module that sorts the world into faces, bodies, and movements also grades what it sorts, wired into reward circuits that deliver the little jolt. Into reward circuits that deliver the little jolt of pleasure. Classification and evaluation are logically distinct. You can name a thing without liking it, yet the brain collapses them into one operation. Chatterjee's halo effect is this collapse leaking outward. We misread the automatic pleasure signal as evidence that the beautiful person is also good. This section explains why the brain has no separate module for beauty. The organ that recognizes a face is the organ that rates it. No separate aesthetic module exists. The functional MRI evidence from Chatterjee is the anchor here. The fusiform face area tracks attractiveness even when you are judging identity rather than beauty, and the reward circuit, the nucleus accumbens and the orbitofrontal cortex, lights up for pretty faces while your attention is on shape. Classification and evaluation are logically distinct. One question asks, is this a face? The other asks, do I like it? Yet the brain refuses the distinction, running both through one tuned module coupled to reward. This is where the halo effect comes from. Perception grades beauty involuntarily, so we leak that grade onto unrelated judgments of character. The generative move for every later case, for bodies and for dance, is this. Predict shared machinery, not a dedicated beauty center. This section explains how beauty works as a readout of fitness. Beauty decodes fitness. The hoodoo carries the compression. No sculptor shapes the spire. Erosion passively strips the soft strata, leaving the hard capstone standing. Selection reveals. It never designs. Preference obeys the same passivity. Creatures that happen to find fitness correlated traits attractive left more offspring, so the taste accumulated with no one ever learning why. 2 engines drive it: natural selection for survival and sexual selection for reproduction. The 3 things a face reads as beautiful are averageness, symmetry, and sexual dimorphism. Each one decodes a single axis of health. Averageness reads the prototype, symmetry reads developmental integrity, and dimorphism reads hormone load. Predict the next case from this. Any trait that reliably tracks fitness and is costly to fake becomes beautiful. The peacock's ruinous tail. A man's Rolex. This part explains why beauty feels the way it does, treating it as a readout of fitness rather than a property of the thing seen. Beauty is what fitness looks like from inside a nervous system that was selected to crave it. Pleasure is the decoder. What you respond to is the fitness, and the pleasure is only its readout. Chatterjee's hoodoos carry the whole move. No sculptor plans the spire. Erosion passively removes the soft strata, and the hard capstone remains. The same passive carving fixes both the trait and the taste for it in one stroke. Averageness, symmetry, and sexual dimorphism read as honest health, so the ancestors who desired them left morphism read as honest health, so the ancestors who desired them left more children, and we inherited the desire. 2 riders complete the picture. The costly signal inverts the logic. The peacock's tail, the Rolex, and testosterone's hit to the immune system prove fitness because they handicap. And peak shift lets culture exaggerate the cue past anything nature ever built. This section explains why we find certain landscapes beautiful using one machine read on a new object. The beauty of places is the same. Move, the book made for faces, perception doubling as a fitness readout with one part swapped. The selector changes from sexual selection to natural selection. A landscape looks beautiful when its features once predicted: safety and sustenance, the open sightlines of the savanna, water, climbable trees, a distant horizon, and a little mystery to reward exploring. The anchor is the savanna hypothesis. Children prefer savanna vistas they have never seen, so the preference is priored in, then tuned by where you happen to live. The generative primitive is this. A beautiful thing is a fitness indicator, and the brain sensory classifier, here, the parahippocampal place area, fires together with the reward circuitry to predict the next instance, whether numbers or art. Ask what it was once a signal for. This section explains why we find certain landscapes beautiful and how that reaches beyond faces and bodies. Beauty is a fitness indicator, a percept. The brain evolved to fire when a stimulus signals ancestral survival value. This chapter's move is subsumptive. Take that logic, proven on faces and bodies, and push it into a domain where the face-specific machinery fails. Averageness, symmetry, and sexual selection simply do not apply to a valley. What survives the transfer is the invariant beneath them. We find the savanna and its descendants beautiful because their features were signals of safety and sustenance to Pleistocene forages, water, a distant horizon, sheltering trees, and the mystery of a path bending out of sight. The driver shifts from sexual to natural selection, yet the primitive holds. Beauty tracks fitness, whatever the object. Predict the next domain, numbers, art, from this alone. This section walks through the chapter on numbering beauty, whose whole move is that beauty survives the removal of the senses. Faces and landscapes might count as beauty felt through sensation. Numbers cannot, since we neither desire nor inhabit them, yet phi and Euler's identity read as beautiful regardless. That observation forces Schmidhuber's reframing. Beauty is the felt signature of compression. Pleasure fires when a short rule captures much data, poised between the too regular, which is merely obvious, and the too chaotic, which is merely overwhelming. Phi is the anchor here. One irrational ratio, folding the Fibonacci numbers, sunflower spirals, and galaxies into itself. The chapter thereby subsumes every earlier sensory beauty as a special case of compression and roots the pleasure in natural selection. Ancestors who enjoyed capturing pattern foraged better and survived. This section puts number on the stand as the hostile witness. Chatterjee reaches for the least sensuous object imaginable, the abstract integer, phi, Euler's identity. He picks it precisely because it still trips the reward machinery, which proves the machinery runs deeper than the senses. The generative primitive beauty is the felt signal of compression. Phi and the identity e to the ip plus 1 equals 0 register as beautiful because each is minimal in assumptions yet generalizes wildly. This is Schmidhuber's point, that pleasure marks a regularity newly compressed, neither too obvious nor too chaotic. So the same circuitry that scores a face scores a theorem, but along a different axis. Russell called this beauty cold and austere. It is liking without wanting, reward untethered from desire, which the face never manages. This section explains why beauty resists a single underlying logic. Beauty is a mongrel. Chatterjee's whole first part on faces, landscapes, and proofs converges on one denial, that no single property underwrites all three. Different objects fire different specialized brain regions. They ride different reward temperatures, the hot desire of an attractive face against the cold contemplation of a proof. And they were shaped by different pressures, sexual selection for people, natural selection for places, and the pleasure of information compression for numbers. The inversion that turns the whole argument is the hoodoo argument. Usefulness accompanies beauty but never causes it. What survived was the pleasure that happened to attach to an adaptive trait. The preference was illogical to begin with, and it merely outbred its equally illogical rivals. So beauty admits no unifying logic, only pleasure. Examine next. This section explains why beauty is best understood as a mongrel concept. Beauty is a mongrel. It is not one property with one cause, but a bundle of unrelated ones that happen to share a single word. Faces, savannas, and elegant proofs light up different brain regions and answer to different selective pressures, sexual selection, natural selection, and the pleasure of compressing information. Natural selection and the pleasure of compressing information. Chatterjee's sharpest move is the reversal in the hoodoo parable. Usefulness never caused beauty. A feature happened to be adaptive, and the pleasure that incidentally rode along on it is what survived, while equally arbitrary rival pleasures died out. So the preferences we call universal did not begin universal. They ended that way. There is nothing logical about what we find beautiful, and that illogic is the point. This section explains what pleasure is at its root. Pleasure is one axis wearing many coats, the subjective face of a single control variable, approach versus avoid, that runs unbroken from the amoeba, tracking a chemical gradient up through mammalian homeostasis into reward. Food, sex, money, and art are that same axis at increasing remove. First, the primary reinforcers, then the secondary ones we learn to crave. This chapter opens the book's pleasure half, exactly as its twin opened the beauty half, asking whether all pleasures share a common currency. It plants the difference that governs everything after. Humans, unlike Chatterjee's hedonist cats, run a second loop over the first, framing a sensation to change it and discounting it across time. Sensation below, cognition reaching down. Food first. This section explains pleasure as a single currency underneath many objects. Pleasure is one currency wearing many objects. The approach signal, a brain stamps on whatever once raised an ancestor's odds of reproducing. Food, sex, money, a one bet, a sunset, all of them cash out to the same valuation. That valuation is the amoeba's approach and avoidance chemistry, elaborated through homeostasis into amoeba's approach and avoidance chemistry, elaborated through homeostasis into mammalians. Chatterjee opens the pleasure part by asking of pleasure exactly what he asked of beauty. One center, one currency. He asks this because the chapter's real work is to install pleasure as the substrate that beauty and art will later be built from. What divides us from his hedonist cats is a cognitive overlay. The first piece is framing, where context rewrites a sensation's value. The second is forward discounting, time wedged between wanting and having. This section explains why food is where Chatterjee anchors the whole book's argument about pleasure. Pleasure is a channel evolution wired to fitness, and food is where that wiring shows most clearly. The reward chemistry, dopamine, opioid, and cannabinoid converges on the orbital frontal cortex. It is hardwired, infants gag at bitter and lunge at sweet. Yet it is also soft-tuned because expectation and knowledge literally rewrite the felt reward. Chatterjee points to the labeled Coke effect and the priced wine effect, where knowing the label or the price changes how good the thing actually tastes. Here is the surprising part, the finding that carries the argument: the most survival-critical pleasure we have is already this plastic. Something as close to raw fitness as eating turns out to be open to rewriting by mere belief. That plasticity is exploitable. Junk food is a caricature, the peak shift trick from the beauty chapters aimed at the palate, driving the reward circuit past its adaptive set point. It is the same move that exaggerates a signal until the response overshoots what evolution tuned it for. The consequence sets up everything after. If bare survival pleasure bends this far, then art, which is pleasure untethered from survival, will bend further still. Food is the tractable base case for everything that follows. This part explains why Chatterjee opens his account of pleasure with food. He begins there precisely because food should be the pleasure that cannot bend. Smell and taste bypass the thalamus, reach the reward system almost unfiltered, and are hardwired before birth. The chapter's whole work is to show that even this most survival-tethered reward is a valuation rather than a reflex. Satiety, expectation, and mere knowledge reshape the same orbitofrontal signal. The labeled Coke, the wine you have been told is expensive. Each of these bends the response. The generative move is this: pick the least flexible pleasure, demonstrate its plasticity, and the plasticity of everything downstream follows a fortiori. Junk food is the dark corollary. It is the peak shift caricature that hijacks a preference by exaggerating its cue. If food bends, then art's pleasure is wide open. This section explains sex as the second run of a single architecture, where the repetition itself is the argument. The same three-act loop that ran on food runs again. First comes desire, driven by dopamine and the amygdala pushing toward approach. Then consummation. Then the satiety breaks of the orbitofrontal cortex. So, the loop is general and not specific to appetite. The move that does the work is decoupling. Pleasure detaches from its adaptive cause and binds to arbitrary objects. Fetish learning welds arousal to knee-high boots. Pain reframes into pleasure. An adaptive mechanism that evolved for procreation got co-opted for recreation. That suppleness, pleasure as a reusable substrate, plastic in what it attaches to, is the bridge. Chatterjee is laying toward beauty in art. Proving it twice, on food and on sex, is what earns the generalization. This part explains how sex runs the same reward machine the previous chapter built for food, run again to prove the machine generalizes. Dopamine anticipates the reward without delivering its peak. An amygdala drives approach, then quiets on contact. A lateral OSC brake installs satiety. The chapter's real payload is the second half, that this machine is context malleable. Pain inverts to pleasure under arousal. The childbirth co-opt. Neutral objects capture desire. Fetish as Pavlov. Guilt curdles pleasure back into aversion. An adaptive mechanism that evolved for procreation got co-opted for recreation. That suppleness is the primitive Chandra hands forward. If base pleasure is this reframable by context, aesthetic response will be too. This section explains why money serves as the control case in Chatterjee's account of the pleasure arc. Money is a token with no appetitive tie. You neither eat it nor mate with it. Yet, the ventral striatum and the medial orbitofrontal cortex light up for it exactly as they do for food and sex. That collapse is the primitive. Pleasure floats free of bodily need. Any neutral signal reliably paired with reward inherits reward's machinery. Chatterjee's undergraduate quarters became pleasure discs, the same Pavlovian graft as boots fetishized beside erotic images. Once money rides the primary circuitry, it inherits its bugs too. Loss aversion, endowment, discounting, framing, the casino as applied neuroeconomics. The chapter's move is abstraction by association. Show pleasure detaching from its evolutionary object, and the whole apparatus of irrational value follows as consequence. This section explains how pleasure comes apart from appetite. Pleasure detaches from appetite, and money is the proof. It is paper you neither eat nor mate with, yet it fires the same ventral striatum reward circuitry as food and sex. The mechanism is Pavlovian. A neutral token paired often enough with a primary reward inherits the reward itself and becomes a reinforcer in its own right. Chatterjee's undergraduate quarters were literally pleasure discs. That single move, a conditioned stimulus borrowing the circuitry of the thing it predicts, is what the chapter installs. Because the book's real target is art, another pleasure severed from appetite. Money is the bridge, the cleanest case where reward runs on association rather than on need, and where framing therefore governs everything. This section explains how pleasure splits into 3 separate channels, running on one shared substrate. Pleasure factors into 3 dissociable channels, riding one substrate. Liking is the hedonic hit, carried by opioids and cannabinoids. Wanting is the pull toward the thing, carried by dopamine. Learning is dopamine again, now firing on the gap between predicted and received reward. Barrage's rats prove the seams are real. Block dopamine and the rat still savors sweetness but stops chasing it. Addiction runs the mirror image, wanting swollen while liking withers. The move that carries the chapter is what this buys. The book's argument, the reward system, is substrate. agnostic. Ultimatum. Game fairness lights up the same disgust region of the insula as sour milk. Trust recruits the same striatal dopamine as food. So, aesthetic pleasure needs no dedicated organ. Beauty, fairness, and art are the appetite machinery running on abstract inputs. This part explains that reward is not a single system, but 3 separable channels running on shared brain hardware. Reward runs on 3 separable channels. The first is liking, the pleasure itself, run on opioids and cannabinoids. The second is wanting, the pursuit, run on dopamine. The third is learning, dopamine again, firing above baseline when a reward beats prediction, and below baseline when a reward beats prediction, and below baseline when it disappoints. Berridge's rats expose the seam between these channels. Kill their dopamine and they still lick their lips at sweetness, yet they stop chasing food. Liking survives without wanting. Addiction is the mirror image of this uncoupling, craving without pleasure. The generative move is that these are factored modules sitting on shared hardware, so anything that taps them becomes rewarding. An abstract valuation simply exapts the appetite circuitry. Unfairness recruits the same insula that recoils from rancid food. Trust runs on the same striatal dopamine that tracks good gelato. This section explains pleasure as a single controller that runs every moving creature. Every moving creature runs one controller. Approach what you need, avoid what harms. Pleasure is that controller's corrective signal. It is homeostatic, pulling the organism back into its viable window. The same logic runs from craving salt when depleted, up to a species tracking its environment across evolution. Tip: 1 mechanism, nested scales. The chapter's move is this. Aesthetic pleasure is that same appetitive controller stretched, not a new faculty. Liking is uncoupled from wanting, laced with emotion more complex than mere liking, and penetrated by what you know. And here is the sting it plants for the art section. That controller was tuned to an ancestral world it no longer matches. So art rides a brain behind its time, a fantastic accident rather than an instinct. This section explains how pleasure works as a single control system and how aesthetic pleasure fits inside it. Approach and avoidance is the single axis, and pleasure is what tunes it. The same homeostatic control loop recurs at every scale. A salt craving, a species tracking its niche, a taste for elegant proofs are one mechanism running on different inputs. The move that does the work here is the decoupling. Liking, carried by opioid and cannabinoid systems in the nucleus accumbens, and wanting, carried by dopamine, are separable currencies. Normally they are yoked together, but they can be prized apart. Aesthetic pleasure is this appetite, machinery stretched, biased toward liking without wanting, admixed with richer emotion, and colored by what you know. Nothing new is added. The loop is merely fed, stranger inputs. This closes the pleasure section by refusing a separate faculty of beauty, and it sets up the sting for art. The adapted brain has fallen behind its own accelerating culture. This section asks what this thing called art is. Every proposed essence of art dies to a counterexample the art world itself supplies. Imitation dies to photography. Communal ritual dies to a tin of murda d'artista that binds no one. Beauty dies to Dada. Emotional expression dies to Dada. Emotional expression dies to a Warhol Brillo box indistinguishable from the one on the grocery shelf. What survives the wreckage is a relational move. art is fixed by its function in a life or by its place in an institutional and historical narrative, the line taken by Danto and Dickey. It is never fixed by a property of the object. The chapter's primitive is Chatterjee's inversion of the parable of the blind men and the elephant. The touches need not converge. Perhaps there is no elephant. Definition by essence is the wrong frame. The encounter constitutes art, and no predicate on the object contains it. This section follows the hunt for the essence of art, and why every proposed essence fails the same way. Imitation dies with photography. Communal ritual cannot bind the can of artist shit. Beauty divorces from Dada. And each anti-essentialist rescue, whether family resemblance, cluster concept, functionalist, or institutional, only relocates the arbitrariness of deciding which feature. The chapter's work in the book's arc is to withhold the definition it spends its length hunting. Chatterjee crystallizes the withholding by inverting the parable of the blind men and the elephant. The comforting reading says each philosopher touches one true part of a whole beast. But if we too are blind, maybe each touches a real pillar, a real wall, a real spear, and there is no elephant. The generative primitive is this. When every candidate essence collapses and only relations survive, suspect a cluster concept. The assumption of a natural kind is the part that failed. This section explains how one axis, the degree of pre-programming, dissolves the old fight over whether art is biological instinct or cultural invention. The clash between art as biological instinct and art as cultural invention is false. Both caricatures collapse. Once you notice two things, the brain is plastic, and culture is only what a collection of brains secretes. Chatterjee, in Chapter 2, replaces the binary with a single axis, the degree of pre-programming. He calibrates that axis with 3 anchors. The first anchor is depth perception, hardwired and universal. The second is oral language, hardwired yet surfacing in mutually unintelligible tongues that all rest on a shared deep grammar. The third is reading, a pure cultural plug in that nonetheless colonizes fixed neural territory, the visual word form area, whose damage yields pure alexia. So the question about art stops being whether and becomes where. Which anchor does it resemble? The chapter sharpens that question and defers the answer. This section explains how a false dichotomy about art dissolves once you see that both of its poles rest on the same substrate. A false dichotomy dissolves once you notice both poles rest on the same substrate. Chatterjee's framing that art is either biology or culture collapses because a brain is plastic, learning is physical, rewiring, and culture is made of brains. Each pole already contains the other. What replaces the binary is a graded axis of inatness. Read off 3 anchors. Depth perception is hardwired and universal. Oral language is hardwired, deep grammar with a locally variable surface. Reading is a plug-in, a cultural tool grafted on, yet one that still carves itself a fixed brain region, the visual word form area. Where art sits on that axis is the chapter's held. Open question. The primitive is this: do not ask which pole a trait belongs to. Ask how far along the innate to grafted gradient the trait falls. This section explains why the parallel between art and the visual brain, however striking, stops short of being a proof. Descriptive neuroaesthetics notices that painters isolate exactly the attributes the visual brain dissects. Zeki finds the fauves severing color from form. Livingstone finds the isoluminant shimmer. The low spatial frequency channel carries the Mona Lisa smile. The field reads this coincidence as artists having discovered the wiring. Chatterjee makes the cut that undoes the inference. Any craft, tuned over centuries to human satisfaction, must fit the brain, so the fit reveals nothing new. The structure a parallel shares with its object does not make it a mechanism. The correlation is real and empty at the same time. To say Cezanne was a neuroscientist commits a category error. It is like saying a platypus is a bird because they both have beaks. A clever conjecture stays an untested hypothesis, which is precisely what the next chapter is for. This section explains descriptive neuroaesthetics, the reading of art as the visual brain made explicit. Art is reverse-engineered perception. The brain encodes only a lossy subset of the world, dissected attributes, shortcuts on shadow and refraction, peak shift, exaggeration. An artist who optimizes to that internal representation rather than to physical reality reliably moves us. Descriptive neuroaesthetics is that reading. It catalogs the parallels and treats art as the brain made explicit. The thesis of the chapter is the boundary drawn on that move. Parallel is not identity. Calling Cezanne a neuroscientist is the platypus. It's a bird error, shared protuberance, different kind. A correlation between technique and mechanism stays an untested conjecture. Only prediction and experiment convert it, which is why experimental neuroaesthetics must follow. This section explains why the neuroscience of art keeps arriving at a single negative result. There is no art module, and that absence is the whole spine of the chapter. Chatterjee runs the methodological history. Fechner's bottom-up psychophysics, the Gestaltist's holistic chunking, Berline's arousal and complexity, and the modern image statistics revival, where paintings carry the same scale, invariant Fourier signatures as natural landscapes. All of it converges the fMRI evidence on one finding. Scan the brain encountering art, and you find no dedicateds on one finding. Portraits light the face area. Landscapes light the place area. Beauty lights the same orbitofrontal reward system that fires for food, for sex, and for money. The aesthetic experience is cobbled together from machinery evolved for everything else, a core triad of sensation, meaning, and emotion, each one borrowed. The pattern to keep is exaptation rather than a module, so predict any future art, and brain finding as the reuse of general perception plus reward, never as a sequestered art organ. This part explains how the brain produces the aesthetic response to art. The brain has no organ built for beauty. It assembles the aesthetic response by borrowing circuits that evolved for everything else. The visual maps that parse faces and places, the memory structures that carry meaning, and the reward system in the orbitofrontal cortex, and the nucleus accumbens that also lights up for food, sex, and money. There is no art module, and that absence is the chapter's whole claim. You can predict where art will register by asking what ordinary faculty each artwork happens to recruit. Fechner's thread, called outer psychophysics, carries the same shape one level down. Preference tracks measurable stimulus properties we never consciously notice. Pollock's paintings have a fractal dimension near 1.5, and art shares scale, invariant Fourier spectra with natural scenes. These are lawful links between the structure of the world and the pleasure it evokes. This section explains conceptual art as the limit case of Chatterjee's aesthetic triad, the point where an artwork survives on meaning alone. Strip the frame, the eye pleasure, the beauty, and what remains is pure meaning. That residue is the whole artwork. Conceptual art is Chatterjee's limit case, Serrano's urine-lit crucifix, Antoni's gnawed cubes, or Lan's surgeries. It drains the sensation and emotion channel to zero, so the piece is its idea and nothing else. The move is diagnostic. It splits the aesthetic triad of sensation, emotion, and meaning along a fault line. Sensation and emotion are stable and near universal, so neuroscience grips them. Culturally shifting meaning is too slippery to hold. The intractably avant-garde art, therefore, marks precisely where neuroaesthetic stops. And the deeper claim leaks back onto everything. Meaning was always the layer the rest depended on, merely hidden under beauty in older art. This part explains what conceptual art reveals about the limits of neuroaesthetics. Strip a work of everything pleasing to the eye. Leave a stack of paper, a bitten cube of lard, a surgical incision, and what remains is pure meaning. That is Chatterjee's move. Conceptual art isolates the third term of his aesthetic triad: sensation, emotion, and meaning. By isolating that term, it exposes what was always latent beneath representation. It exposes what was always latent beneath representational art too. The structural surprise sits in the mismatch. Neuroscience is built for the first two terms, the stable and universal regularities of line and color. The brain is tuned to. Meaning is variable, historical, and viewer. Relative, and therefore close to it. The chapter marks a boundary. Science tracks the groove of sensation and emotion, while the culturally folded content of an individual work slips through. Predict the rest yourself. Wherever a work's force lies in interpretation, the instrument goes blind. This section traces where art comes from and why the search for its origin dead ends. Chase art back to its beginning, expecting a pristine, definable essence, and you find the same tangle you fled. That is the chapter's move. Chatterjee walks backward from Lascaux through Chauvet, the Blombos ochre, the Tantan figure, and the Homo erectus quartz, and the record never converges on a first pure art. It fragments into episodes that flared and died under local ecology and demography, with no single function anyone can name. The surprise that shifts your model is this: there was no big bang of creativity, no lineage, no essence waiting at the root. Art is polyphyletic. It arises independently, many times, wherever conditions allowed. A category that is ill-defined at its richest form inherits that same indefinition at its origin. The beginning clarifies nothing. The end left murky. This part explains why art has no single origin point. Run any phenomenon backward, expecting it to narrow to a seed, a first instance that defines the essence. Chatterjee runs art backward, from Lascaux through Chauvet, Blombos ochre. The Big Bang in Europe story collapses. The Macapans get cobble, and it diverges instead. Pigment, beads, engravings, and Venus-shaped pebbles surface independently across Neanderthals, Homo erectus, maybe Australopithecus, in fits and starts that flare and die with no shared function. The Big Bang. In Europe's story collapse, the structural primitive is that art is polyphyletic, many inceptions, no ancestral point where its definition crystallizes. Origin seeking as a definitional shortcut fails whenever the thing has no single root. The cave paintings stay unreadable, and admiring is not understanding. This sets up the next question. Is there an art instinct? This section explains how to sort any feature of a mind by its origin before the question of art ever arises. A mind accretes rather than being designed. The chapter's move is to hand you a provenance sorter for any trait, a way to file each feature, by how it came to be there, not by what it does now. Every feature falls into one bin. An adaptation was selected to solve a past problem. A spandrel rides along without function, like the whiteness of bone. An acceptation is a spandrel that the changed environment made useful, like feathers which gave warmth and then led to flight. A secondary adaptation is later refinement of that. To this, add two more forces. Plasticity means the same genes build different bodies. Niche construction means the organism rewrites its own selection pressures, the way a beaver reshapes the world that then selects it. The taxonomy is the whole payload. Once you hold it, you can already predict the next question. Which bin does art fall into? This section lays out the toolbox of evolutionary mechanisms that the argument about art will later draw from. The mind is accreted rather than engineered, a grab bag of mechanisms that pile up across generations, only some of them designed for what they now do. Chatterjee lays out the taxonomy. Adaptations are traits built to solve past problems. Spandrels are functionless byproducts like the whiteness of bone. Acceptations are spandrels that a changed environment recruits, the way feathers served first for warmth and then for flight. Secondary adaptations refine those. Local conditions add plasticity and niche, construction on top. The move the argument turns on is disjunctive. Art need not be an adaptation to count as evolutionary. It could equally be a spandrel or an acceptation. This chapter is the toolbox. The next one asks which slot art fills. This section explains the single move that organizes the whole chapter. Chatterjee borrows the diagnostic test from medicine and turns it on every claim that art is an evolved instinct. A diagnostic test has two properties. Sensitivity asks whether the marker fires whenever art is present. Specificity asks whether it stays silent when art is absent. Run the candidate markers through this test, and each one fails twice over. Beauty, costly signaling, usefulness, social cohesion, every proposed marker fails on both sides. Art exists without the marker. In conceptual art, in Gaikin, in Goya, none of them beautiful. And the marker exists without art, in football jerseys, in luxury watches, in goose-stepping soldiers. A marker that is neither necessary nor sufficient cannot diagnose an instinct. The transferable primitive is this. An adaptationist claim that art is some single thing. X is a two-sided classifier, and a classifier that leaks on both sides identifies nothing. This section explains how Chatterjee tests the claim that art is an evolved instinct. His move is to borrow a criterion from diagnostic medicine, sensitivity, and specificity, and turn it against every such claim. A property earns the status of instinct only if all art carries it, which makes the test sensitive, and only art carries it. Run the four candidate properties through this sieve and each one fails both cutoffs. Beauty misses, provocative art, and it floods over flowers. Costly signaling misses commissioned religious icons, and it floods over luxury watches. Usefulness proves nothing at all, since written language is useful, yet no one calls it an evolved adaptation. Social cohesion misses the lone artist working in isolation, and it floods over goose-stepping soldiers. The primitive to carry forward is this. A universal plus adaptive intuition dies the moment you demand a test that both catches its own cases and excludes everything else. This part explains why art belongs to the relaxed evolutionary engine, not the intensified one. There are two engines, opposite in sign, and art comes from the one nobody reaches for first. The peacock's tail is intensified selection. Cost advertises fitness, and the pressure drives the trait toward a single honed form. The Bengalese finch's song is the inverse. The bird was bred for plumage, so its song was released from any mating function, and precisely because the content stopped mattering, the song grew more complex, more variable, more learnable, and more responsive to what the bird hears. The generative move here is relaxation, not optimization. Tighten selection and variety is culled toward fixation. Relax it and variety blossoms. Art is the finch. It is rooted in adaptation, in imagination, symbol, and beauty. Yet it is powerful today exactly because it is untethered from those roots, free to mutate inside human-made cultural niches. This part explains how two evolutionary regimes, opposite in sign, generate the false dichotomy the chapter dissolves. Intensified selection calls variance toward fixation. Think of the peacock's tail, honed and stereotyped, the adaptationist's art. Relaxed selection does the reverse. Once a trait stops paying its way, deviation is no longer weeded out, so variety drifts open. Think of the Bengalese finch, whose song grew complex precisely as it became reproductively irrelevant. Art is the finch, not the tail. It keeps its adaptive roots, imagination, symbol, and beauty, yet it blossoms only where the pressures that forged those roots slacken. Here is the generative move. Novelty is released by the absence of selection rather than built by selection itself, and the corollary, the author states flatly, is this: the variety of art measures a society's freedom. This section explains why there is no dedicated faculty for art. No aesthetic organ exists, no receptor, no emotion, no module dedicated to art. That absence is the whole book's payload. Beauty, pleasure, and art each turn out to be a mongrel, a loose ensemble of adaptations that happen to route through one shared reward system. The adaptations are things like averaged faces, safe landscapes, and compressible proofs. Art is therefore a third way, standing apart from both instinct and mere by-product. It is the relaxation of instinctual constraint, the same move the Bengalese finch's song made away from its wild ancestors. Freed from a fixed program, art can flower unpredictably. Universal themes still arrive only in a local idiom. Serendipity is the structural consequence of having no organ built to produce it. This section explains why art is a third way, neither an instinct nor a mere byproduct. The chapter closes the book by naming its own generative move. Art has no dedicated module, no aesthetic receptor, no art instinct. Instead, relaxed instinctual constraint is what lets art proliferate. Where selection pressure tightens, art stays inside narrow, stylized bounds. Where it slackens, art blossoms. This is the same structure Chatterjee borrows from the Bengalese finch, whose song grew complex only once. Domestication released it from wild selective pressure. Beauty is a mongrel, many adaptations funneling into one pleasure channel. Art is a chimera, built from adaptations, spandrels, exaptations, and plugins. The primitive to keep is this: constraint relaxation generates open-ended variety. Art germinates instinctually and matures serendipitously, and its unpredictability is itself the content of the theory rather than a failure of it.